So, I got your text again. I know you can't sleep. By the way, thank you for not spamming my phone this time. It's greatly appreciated. But I came prepared. So right here, I brought The Way Things Work, written by David Macaulay. Now, let me just join you. Now, of course, you know that I am studying engineering, but my whole life, I've always just loved the mechanics, the way things work, all that stuff. So, when my dad gave me this old book of his, I found it super interesting, and I liked to read it before bed when I was younger. Might be a little weird, but, you know, that's why I'm curious. I want to know how old this book is, honestly. There's a chance it's older than me. Let's see. Oh. It says, copyright 1988. Which means my dad got this book when he was still in high school. That's kind of weird. This book is a lot older than I am. But of course, with any good book, we start at the beginning, past all of those different pages of contents, at the introduction, as you can see here. Now, this whole book uses mammoths to illustrate concepts, so we'll see that as we get into it. Let's start at the introduction. To any machine, work is a matter of principle, because everything a machine does is in accordance with a set of principles or scientific laws. To see the way a machine works, you can take the covers off and look inside. But to understand what goes on, you need to get to know the principles that govern its actions. The machines in this and the following parts of The Way Things Work are therefore grouped by their principles rather than by their uses. This produces some interesting neighbors. The plow rubs shoulders with the zippers, for example, and a hydroelectric power station with the dentist's drill. They may look very different, be vastly different in scale, and have different purposes, but when seen in terms of principles, they work in the same way. So, it goes on and explains some of the basic ideas of motion and force, matter, conservation of energy, and then we get to the very first concept. And I think the first one is a good place to start. This is the inclined plane, and you can see a guy right here rolling a stone up this inclined plane to drop on that mammoth. The principle of the inclined plane. The laws of physics decree that raising an object, such as a mammoth stunning boulder, to a particular height requires a certain amount of work. Those same laws also decree that no way can ever be found to reduce that amount. The ramp makes life easier, not by altering the amount of work that is needed, but by altering the way in which the work is done. Work has two aspects to it: the effort that you put in, and the distance over which you maintain the effort. If the effort increases, the distance must decrease, and vice versa. This is easiest to understand by looking at two extremes. Climbing a hill by the steepest route requires the most effort, but the distance that you have to cover is the shortest. Climbing up the gentlest slope requires the least effort, but the distance is greatest. The work you do is the same in either case and equals the effort the force you exert, multiplied by the distance over which you maintain the effort. So what you gain in effort, you pay in distance. This is a basic rule that is obeyed by many mechanical devices, and it is the reason why the ramp works. It reduces the effort needed to raise an object by increasing the distance that it moves. The ramp is an example of an inclined plane. The principle behind the inclined plane was made use of in ancient times. Ramps enabled the Egyptians to build their pyramids and temples. Since then, the inclined plane has been put to work in a whole host of devices, from locks and cutters to plows and zippers, as well as in all the many machines that make use of the screw. So, that was the explanation of the inclined plane, and it also gives a fun little mammoth-based example of how you might use it. So, on capturing a mammoth. In the spring of that year, I was invited to the land of the much sought-after woolly mammoth, a land dotted by the now familiar high wooden towers of the mammoth captors. In ancient times, the mammoth had been hunted simply for its meat, but its subsequent usefulness in industry and growing popularity as a pet had brought about the development of a more sophisticated and less terminal means of apprehension. Each unsuspecting beast was lured to the base of a tower, from which a boulder of reasonable dimensions was then dropped from a humanitarian height onto its thick skull. Once stunned, a mammoth could easily be led to the paddock where an ice pack and fresh swamp grass would quickly overcome hurt feelings and innate distrust. While the process was more or less successful, it had a couple of major drawbacks. The biggest problem was that of simply getting a heavy boulder to the right height. This required an almost Herculean effort, and Hercules was not due to be born for several centuries yet. The second problem was that the mammoth, once hit, would invariably crash into the tower, either hurling his captors to the ground or at least seriously damaging the structure. After making a few calculations, I informed my hosts that both problems could be solved simultaneously by building earth ramps rather than wooden towers. The inherent sturdiness of the ramp would make it virtually indestructible should a mammoth fall against it. And now, rather than trying to hoist the boulder straight up, it could be rolled gradually to the required height, therefore needing far less effort. At first, the simplicity of my solution was greeted with understandable skepticism. "What do we do with the towers?" they asked. I made a few more calculations and then suggested commercial and retail development on the lower levels and luxury apartments above. Whoever wrote this, I love. Well, actually, we do know it's. There we go. David Macaulay. But let's look at this picture again. You can see. Here's the ramp going up, dropping the boulder at a humanitarian height. Then here is the tower, which they were doing it previously. Let's see what else there is to learn about. Different locks and keys. Can openers. The plow, the zipper. Here's levers. See, a lot of the different specifics aren't quite as funny to read as the basic explanations, so I feel like sticking to some of these for now. I don't know. I'll just kind of graze through, see what I think would be fun to read. But levers. The principle of levers. The tree trunk is acting as a lever, which is simply a bar or rod that tilts on a pivot or fulcrum. If you apply a force by pushing or pulling on one part of the lever, The lever swings about the fulcrum to produce a useful action at another point. The force that you apply is called the effort, and the lever moves at another point to raise a weight or overcome a resistance, both of which are called the load. Where you move a lever is just as important as the amount of effort you apply to it. Less effort can move the same load, provided that it is applied further from the fulcrum. However, the effort has to move a greater distance to shift the load. As with the inclined plane, you gain in force what you pay in distance. Some levers reverse this effect to produce a gain in distance moved at the expense of force. With levers, the distances moved by the effort and load depend on how far they are from the fulcrum. The principle of levers, which relates the effort and load, states that the effort times its distance from the fulcrum equals the load times its distance from the fulcrum. And the little drawing here is on weighing a mammoth. You can see that it takes a lot more people to balance when the fulcrum is in the middle of people and a mammoth. And on this side, it takes less people to balance if the fulcrum is much closer to the mammoth, which of course is heavier. Let's see what he has to say about that. On weighing a mammoth. Before being shipped to its final destination, a mammoth must be weighed. I was fortunate enough in one village to witness the procedure at first hand. The center of a tree trunk was placed directly on a boulder. One end of the trunk was then pulled down and the mammoth encouraged to sit on it. No sooner did the beast seem reasonably comfortable than a number of villagers scrambled onto the other end of the trunk. Slowly their end sank and, as it did, the startled mammoth rose into the air. I was told that when the trunk reached a horizontal position, the combined weight of the people would equal that of the mammoth. This seemed reasonable enough. It was then that I noticed across the square a second equally large mammoth about to be weighed, this time using far fewer people as a counterbalance. I watched, anticipating disaster. The boulder was rolled closer to what would be the mammoth's end of the tree trunk. Once the mammoth was in place, a mere handful of people climbed onto the other end. To my amazement, the tree trunk gently assumed a horizontal position. I was then informed that the length of the tree trunk from the people to the border multiplied by their combined weight would equal the length of the trunk from the border equal the length of the trunk from the boulder to the mammoth multiplied by its weight. Sorry, I'm having trouble speaking. I was in the midst of calculations to verify this most unlikely theory when I heard a scream. Apparently all the villagers had not disembarked from the trunk simultaneously, thereby causing a lad to be dramatically launched. I made a note, thinking that one day this might be useful. You can see here, right up here, that's the guy being launched. And it goes on to explain different types of levers. One where the load acts down, the effort points up, both on one side of the fulcrum. One where the load is farther away and the effort is more forceful but closer to the fulcrum. There's a lot about that. Levers in action. Here are a few examples of different types of levers. So we got your standard hand cart, where tipping the handle of the hand cart with a light effort raises a heavy load. Scissors, A pair of scissors is a compound first-class lever. It produces a strong cutting action very near the hinge. The load is the resistance of the fabric to the cutting blades. We have the bottle opener. Pushing up the handle overcomes the strong resistance of a bottle cap. We have the fishing rod. One hand supplies the effort to move the rod, while the other hand acts as the fulcrum. The load is the weight of the fish, which is raised a long distance with a short movement of the hand. Then we have excavators. An excavator is a rotating assembly of 3 levers: the boom, the dipper, and the bucket, mounted on caterpillar tracks. The assembly swings around on the slew ring while the 3 levers positioned by hydraulic ramps combine to place the bucket in any position. The boom is a third-class lever that raises or lowers the dipper. The dipper is a first-class lever that moves the bucket in and out. The bucket is itself another first-class lever that tilts to dig a hole and empty its load. And here is that excavator, right here. I'm struggling to show you everything. I'm sorry if it's not the most clear. I know you're tired, it's hard to focus on a bunch of text and stuff. Then, of course, it goes on to talk about weighing machines and how those work, because those are levers. Grand pianos, typewriters, the parking meter. There's like the wheel and the axle, turbines, windmills. Let's see. Here's gears and belts. This will be interesting. Why don't we talk about this? Yeah. So first off, there is a mammoth example, as there always is, on early mammoth power. As far as I can ascertain, the first use of mammoths in industry was to provide power for the famous merry-go-round experiment. The equipment consisted of 2 wheels, one large and one small, placed edge to edge so that when the mammoths turned one wheel, the other would turn automatically. At first, seats were hung from the small wheel, which was driven by the large wheel. The result was a hair-raising ride. When the wheels were reversed, the ride was far too sedate. Evidently, belts connected to drive wheels of different sizes operated 2 rides simultaneously, one fast and one gentle. Carrot consumption during the experiment was astronomical. And you can see here the 3 examples. So, on the top, the mammoths are at the big wheel powering the smaller one. The middle, the smaller is powering the larger. And at the bottom, a medium one is powering a small one and a large one. Now, types of gears. Gears come in a variety of sizes, with their teeth straight or curved, or inclined at a variety of angles. They are connected together in various ways to transmit motion and force in machines. However, there are only 4 basic types of gears. They all act so that one gear wheel turns faster or slower than the other, or moves in a different direction. A difference in speed between the 2 gears produces a change in the force transmitted. So there are spur gears. 2 gear wheels intermesh in the same plane, regulating the speed or force of motion and reversing its direction. There are rack and pinion gears. One wheel, the pinion, meshes with a sliding toothed rack, converting rotary motion to reciprocating to and fro motion, and vice versa. Worm gears. A shaft with a screw thread meshes with a toothed wheel to alter the direction of motion and change the speed and force. Bevel gears. Two wheels intermesh at an angle to change the direction of rotation, also altering speed and force if necessary. There are sometimes known as a pinion and crown wheel or pinion and ring gear. Let's see. Now a difference between gears and belts. Gears. The big wheel has twice the number of teeth and twice the circumference of the small wheel. It rotates with twice the force and half the speed in the opposite direction. And belts does the same thing in terms of the size of the wheels. And it also rotates with, twice the force, half the speed, but it goes in the same direction because it's attached by a belt and not by teeth. So you can see those all here. These are all the different types of gears and the belts at the bottom. Right there. Yeah. What else do we got? Yes, there are a lot of different types of gears in here. There is a lot in this book. I bet we could get a good few nights of bedtime stories out of this book if we really wanted to. Here we go. Here's all about screws, nuts, and bolts. So let's start with let's start here. The screw is a heavily disguised form of inclined plane, one which is wrapped around a cylinder, just as the knight's ramp encircles the tower. As we have already seen, inclined planes alter force and distance. When something moves along a screw thread, like a nut on a bolt, it has to turn several times to move forward a short distance. As in a linear inclined plane, when distance decreases, force increases. A nut, therefore, moves along the bolt with a much greater force than the effort used to turn it. A nut and bolt holds objects together because they grip the object with great force. Friction stops the nut working loose. Friction is something we can talk about another night because that sounds complicated. Now, straight inclined planes are often used as wedges, in which the plane moves to force a load upward. Spiral inclined planes can work like wedges too. In most kinds of screws, the screw turns and moves itself into the material, like the damsel's tower. As with the nut and bolt, the turning effort is magnified so that the screw moves forward with an increased force. The force acts on the material to drive the screw into it. As the case of the nut and bolt, friction acts to hold the screw in the material. The friction occurs between the spiral thread and the material around it. It is strong because the spiral thread is long, and the force between the thread and material is powerful. And then we have examples about mammoths. On the intelligence of mammoths. I have recently unearthed a document which, I believe, proves beyond doubt the much debated intellectual capacity of mammoths. One day, the document records, while seeking some good to do, a knight and his mammoth came across a damsel imprisoned at the top of a stone tower. The tower contained no doors and only tiny windows. The knight attempted to rescue the damsel with a short ladder, but his armor was so heavy that he found the climb impossible. Next it appears that he built a long ramp by tying several planks together. Unfortunately, the knight was no good at tying knots. The knight's next idea was to assemble the planks into another ramp and to fix it in a spiral around the tower. But the ramp was not long enough to reach the damsel. At this point, the trusty mammoth acted. He picked up a nearby tree trunk, inserted it into one of the windows, and turned the entire tower. Uncertain of what was going on, the knight joined in. To his amazement, the end of the ramp started to dig into the soil. By turning the tower so many times, they slowly screwed it into the ground. Soon the top of the tower was within easy reach of the ladder, and the dizzy damsel skipped to freedom. And here you can see all the examples. See, there's a ladder not working, a bad ramp, and here's screwing it into the ground. Yeah. So, I feel like that's a decent amount of knowledge for one night. I hope that you found it relaxing enough listening to, well, a bunch of just basic engineering. And good night, and I'll see you later.